Hi there, my name is Rob Verkerk. I'm going to be taking you through today a presentation I gave at Olympia in London on the 10th of July 2016. The presentation was called Stop the Clock, Unlocking the Mysteries of Anti-Aging. We're going to be looking at anti-aging not so much from the external point of view, but from the internal point of view, slowing the process of aging from the inside out. Many of the diseases that we suffer from in society these days are actually diseases of aging. They're chronic degenerative diseases. They can be very much impacted by fundamental changes in our biology. And of course, the most important way of actually restoring that process is by altering what we eat, how we live, how we think, how we feel. And that's really what today's presentation is about. Of course, many of us bring with us our own personal stories, and I have my own. I've eaten very healthy food. I'm chemically hypersensitive, so over 35 years ago, I started consuming a very clean diet, mainly of organic foods. And of course, eating a so-called healthy diet isn't enough for all of us, depending on your genetics. In my case, a combination of that and um, overwork and very stressful conditions in life contributed to me putting on weight, moving into a position in which low-grade inflammation was predominant within my system. I started to become insulin resistant, moving down the journey towards type 2 diabetes, and I couldn't go more than a few hours without feeling hyperglycemic. So I'd have to snack, and of course, the more you do that, the more you're in a vicious circle of managing blood glucose with carbohydrates, and of course pushing yourself into metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes eventually. I knew how important it was to exercise, but I simply didn't have enough energy to do that. In the space of a couple of years, really, I was able to turn the system around. And of course, in doing that, one of the absolute keys was to develop metabolic flexibility, was to become fat adapted so that I could use fat as my long-range fuel as nature intended. It meant that I had developed a healthy inflammatory response, so that inflammation works when subjected to injury or infection, but it isn't maintained permanently within the system. I absolutely love exercising now. I can travel great distances either on foot or on a bicycle without consuming any form of additional food because I'm fat adapted. And of course, in doing that, I've really enhanced my mitochondrial reserve, the little organelles that generate energy within our bodies, so that I have a greater mitochondrial volume and a greater density. There are four basic things we really need to get right in the anti-aging equation. One of them is we need to increase the amount of energy in our system. Becoming frail in old age isn't inevitable. It is very much down to us changing our lifestyles coupled with a slower metabolism. And so we need to work at it to maintain our energetic reserve. We need to keep working at triggering our mitochondria and feeding our mitochondria so that we can develop energy. Without enough energy in the system, we can't heal properly, we can't repair, let alone use that energy to get out and about. We need to develop really robust, well-modulated immune systems. And in doing that, we need the right nutrients in our body. Food is information. Food isn't just energy for sustenance. And the more we look at the diet, the more we find that there's this extremely complex interplay of nutrients that are required for good immune health. The majority of reactions in our immune system are actually centered around our gut, because our gut microbiome, the millions, the trillions of microbes that make up our gut microbiome that outnumber our cells, often up to 10 to 1 human cells in the body, need to be looked after and managed carefully. And the most important way in which we do this is to make sure we have the right foods going into us and we're not consuming foods to which we're intolerant or ones that destabilize the communities of microbes within our gut. We need to manage a healthy inflammatory response, as I mentioned earlier. And in doing that, we need to make sure that we have a response that can be upregulated whenever we're subjected to trauma or we become infected, but then that fire of inflammation goes to rest. So we have just a response that exists for a relatively short period of time. And of course, we need to manage oxidation in our body. Oxidation is essentially rusting when it's applied to steel. The same thing happens in our body. We have reactive oxygen species that we need for certain functions, but again, we need to quench those free radicals. And a very, very important way by which we do that is making sure that our bodies are flooded with antioxidants, both from our diet, and that we also have a healthy antioxidant response from the ones that are actually produced internally, like glutathione. And again, that requires that we're supplying the right foods to our body so that our body can modulate that oxidation adequately. So the $64 million question, if you like, is how do we get there? Well, absolutely key to this process, and of course it's a system that many people, because we have become carb junkies in the process, have lost, is developing metabolic flexibility. What that means is that we can switch to burning fats for large parts of the day, particularly when we're active, using levels of low to moderate intensity, the kind of intensity that gets us about, walking, even jogging gently, or cycling gently. And certainly when it applies to household tasks or moving around in towns and communities, most of us have lost that capacity to burn fats adequately. Fats are set down in our body in order that we can burn them. And if we lose that ability, of course, there's a great danger that we will build fat. And there's a strong body of evidence that suggests that this lack of metabolic flexibility and people becoming over-reliant on carbohydrates as their main fuel source is actually a major contributor to the obesity epidemic. We need to look after the framework, the musculoskeletal system that holds us together. And in doing this, we need to make sure that we have the right nutrients to preserve a strong skeletal structure, and as well the right foods and the right forms of activity to maintain strong muscles so we don't start developing sarcopenia, or so-called age-related muscle wasting as we get older. This demands that we're physically active every day. We don't just leave our exercise to Saturday afternoons, for example. And we must both eat right, but also fast right. And we use this term fasting to refer to the gap between meals. And because many of us eat 3 times a day and then snack in between, we actually don't have adequate time for our bodies to actually quell that fire of inflammation. We also need to rest and recover properly, and there's very clear evidence to suggest that we need to work on our mindfulness, on our emotional health, so that we can be happy. Being happy is actually a very complex set of interactions between our psycho-neuroimmunological systems that allow us to be in a very, very good place. And not enough of us get there, and yet it's very, very important to our overall health. If we look more closely at metabolic flexibility, first thing to recognize is that we don't just have one energy system, we have 3 different energy systems. The first of them is our creatine phosphate system that gives us enough energy burning free ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's the primary fuel that we use for energy. And we have a little bit of that knocking around us in our system that allows us to burn a few seconds worth of energy at very high intensity. So in terms of our ancestors, it was the energy we would use to escape the saber-toothed tiger. Today it's the energy we use to run to the train that's about to leave, or to escape from a building that's on fire, regardless of what our overall state of health is. But we've also got two other major systems, the aerobic metabolic system and the anaerobic metabolic system. As the names imply, the aerobic system uses oxygen within the mitochondria in order to produce ATP, and it does this through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. It produces a lot of energy. Now, typically at school we learn about carbohydrate and glucose, which is the building block of carbohydrates, being used to produce energy in mitochondria. What we don't so often learn is actually the beta oxidation of fatty acids from fats, is the more important fuel. It's a very, very clean burning fuel, and it should really be our primary fuel for most of the day. In burning energy either from fats or carbohydrates with the help of oxygen in aerobic metabolism, we can do that for hours and hours at a time if we're properly trained. And of course, that's what happens when you're an endurance athlete. So as we increasingly discover, there are more and more endurance athletes who are understanding this fundamental process and are understanding the benefits of becoming better adapted to the burning of fats as their primary energy fuel. So fat is becoming the new endurance fuel. Of course, it's not a new endurance fuel at all. It's the way in which our ancestors have always used energy primarily. But if we want to then go even harder for a few minutes, we need to use our anaerobic system. This is the system if you start running upstairs, where you start incurring an oxygen debt. Why? Because you're actually using what is left of some oxygen. Your body is saying we can't sustain this very long because it's starting to produce lactate as part of a fermentation system, and then it's demanding that you go back to the aerobic system, which gives you the oxygen debt that puts you very much out of breath. And we can do this for a few minutes at a time. In all three cases, you can train your system to become better at using free ATP in the creatine phosphate system. You can also train your body to be better at burning fats for your aerobic metabolism, and you can also push your lactate threshold so that it is raised so that you can become very efficient through your anaerobic metabolism. Bottom line is, as you'll see here, is we have only a little bit of ATP available, free floating as muscle ATP. That's why we can't use the creatine phosphate system for very long. What you'll see at the bottom of this table is that the conversion of adipose tissue to fatty acids into carbon dioxide through aerobic metabolism in the mitochondria, you've got a huge amount of ATP available. And you'll see in the middle there, the muscle glycogen, that's the stored carbohydrate in the form of glycogen, or stored glucose in the form of glycogen as lactate, or in muscle glycogen, or in liver. We store this stored carbohydrate in our liver and muscles. We've got a little bit of it there as well, and that's why it cannot last very long. So the real long-term fuel with the most fuel reserves is going to be your fat, and that's based on a 70 kilogram person, not an overweight person. The other thing we need to really work on is improving the function of our mitochondria and the plasticity of them. So by exercising in different ways, we change the volume and the density of our mitochondria. It's been very clearly shown that just a few weeks of endurance exercise will increase the volume of mitochondria by about 50%. And the more that we shift towards fat burning, the more that we grow the capacity to be able to oxidize fatty acids to use the system more efficiently once we become fat adapted, develop metabolic flexibility. We must remember that our genes are essentially relatively unchanged, almost unchanged, compared with those of our ancestors some 20,000 years ago. The big change has, of course, been
in our different lifestyles that now means we've got food at every corner. We're encouraged to eat 3 meals every day, and often snacks in between that. And of course, what this does is throw out this amazing system that has allowed us to exist between, if you like, periods of famine and activity, where we ran out of food. We would then have to be very active in our search for food, and then periods of feast when we would gorge, and we'd then store additional energy that we could use during periods of famine. That system that is controlled by particular protein kinases simply gets disturbed, and that's again a major issue in terms of today's obesity epidemic. In order to move towards metabolic flexibility, we also think of this as nutritional ketosis, a low level of ketosis in which our body produces small amounts of ketone bodies that can be measured in our blood or even in our breath. That happens when we start oxidizing fatty acids. And of course, what happens when you do that, these ketone bodies provide a really excellent fuel for the brain. So actually during that fasted state, a lot of creative people will notice this. You can actually be very, very sharp of mind. Quite the opposite can actually happen when we consume a big meal. We feel very sleepy and very unable to think. It's exactly the opposite of what many people assume. Central to this is this notion of caloric restriction and simple carbohydrate restriction. And of course, we talk about restriction simply because we eat too much. We eat too much in the form of particularly simple, processed, refined carbohydrates. We also need to look at intermittent fasting. And again, we use the term intermittent fasting to just focus on the gap between consuming foods. And because we consume food so regularly in our Western society, we think of it now that we have to break up the periods of eating more specifically so that we can allow these ancient ancestral systems to come into balance again. And so a simple process of having, say, at least 5 hours between meals, and often moving from 3 days a meal for adults to 2 meals a day, perhaps skipping breakfast in the process, and then not snacking in between, can be absolutely key. Another part of it is moving to fasted training, where you actually take exercise at least a couple of times a week on an empty stomach, and that really helps drive your mitochondrial reserve. It helps move you to fat adaptation. In doing this, we need to make sure that we don't go on a low-fat diet, that we actually consume moderate to high amounts of healthy fats. And we've got lots of advice in our Food for Health plate of how you can do that. You also need to make sure that you recover adequately from bouts of activity, and of course that will depend on what your baseline fitness is like in the first place. In treating our mitochondria right, we need to combine in the right amounts strength training with some high intensity interval training, and also some long range, slower, lower intensity endurance training. Generally speaking, we don't want to do any of these exercises back to back, and sometimes not even on the same day, so do them on different days. When it comes to the approaches, there are a number of people like Valter Longo and Jeff Volek and Steve Phinney and Dr. Michael Mosley, who've put forward various ideas that fit into this whole equation. It's about reducing your overall amount of energy you take in. For many people, you get a lot of benefits by reducing about 25% of the total energy you are consuming. Moving to a period where you have 18-hour fasts, that's an overnight fast plus 6 hours, that generally involves skipping breakfast at least 2 to 3 times a week, has many, many benefits, and particularly if you have a slow metabolism. Engaging in fasted training 2 or 3 times a week again. That means getting up in the morning, perhaps having an hour of activity without any food beforehand, only water as for sustenance. Another approach is to use every other day or alternate day fasting, where on your so-called off days you might consume less than 600 calories of food a day. Michael Mosley has brought in the fast diet, where he says essentially consume what you normally consume, but then on 2 days consume less than about 600 or 500 calories for men and women respectively on your fasting days. You should try and use fat as your endurance fuel, which means you need to be consuming sufficient healthy fats, and that's things like olive oil, like coconut oil, making sure that you also have plenty of omega-3 fatty acids. You don't destabilize your omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid. In society, Western society these days, many people consuming a standard diet will be consuming a ratio of omega-6 to 3s that's about 20 to 1, when our ancestors used to consume a ratio of about 1 to 1. So if you can get down to 4 to 1 or 2 to 1, you're doing pretty well. Alternating your strength and endurance exercise, ensuring you do some high intensity interval training. The intensity needs to be high relative to your own fitness. If you have any kind of heart condition, you need to check with a doctor that you can do this type of training. And typically what you do is start with a ratio where your rest period is about twice as long as your high intensity period. And that intensity period might be 30 seconds, it might be a minute, and you can even push it up to 2 minutes or 4 minutes, depending on what your end goal is. What you do in the process is you also cut out all your refined carbohydrates and added sugars in your diet. And that means often removing grains from your diet, or at least gluten-containing grains, and using vegetables as your primary carbohydrate source that is also delivering a lot of phytonutrients in the process. In terms of these diets, we gave lots of advice on our Food for Health plate. We'd encourage you to go to our campaign pages. What we've done is compare the government, the UK government Eat Well plate and the US government My Plate with 2 other plates produced by independent scientists. One is the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, obviously produced by Harvard School of Public Health, and our own Food for Health plate. The key differences between the Harvard plate and our plate is that the Harvard plate is entirely dairy-free, whereas ours suggests dairy is okay for those who are tolerant on it. And while our plate is entirely gluten-free and the Harvard plate isn't, and we believe now with very clear evidence from Fasano and others suggesting that gluten interacts with zonulin in the tight junctions of the gut and therefore creates problems with gut permeability, that gluten for most people, particularly because it's so difficult to know specifically whether you have a sensitivity, often not for decades before the conditions manifest, unless of course you have celiac disease, that we suggest most people are better off going gluten-free anyway. And you'll find, in addition to the description of the kind of foods that should make up a typical day's eating, an additional 10 guidelines. And key to this is consuming unprocessed, or at least not highly refined, highly processed foods. In addition to managing our metabolic flexibility, our immune systems, and reducing oxidative stress, because our diets are so simplified, there are also a whole range of concentrated sources of nutrients that can be added to the diet that are very important to maintain these pathways. And this includes consuming high quality proteins that can be in supplement forms. Vegetarian proteins can be very good. Very important to look at the leucine content, and sometimes it may be necessary to take additional branch chain amino acids that are obviously very rich in leucine, but also taking a range of vitamins and minerals, and also plant extracts ranging from resveratrol to quercetin to curcumin from turmeric, green tea, and coenzyme Q10 for the mitochondria. Many people find it useful to use a bit of technology in the process, and that might include a food balance to actually measure the amount of carbohydrates, protein and fats that you're consuming, bearing in mind that the energy from a gram of fats is about more than twice the amount from a gram of carbohydrate or protein. So we get 9 calories roughly from each gram of fat as against 4 from each gram of carb or protein. You can also benefit from using a body composition scale, these are very useful to measure not just body weight but also the percentage or amount of fat you have in your body, either as adipose tissue and also as visceral fat, the internal fat that can be particularly dangerous, but also your lean muscle mass. Because muscle weighs more than fat, it's very important to maintain an idea of what the ratio of fat to muscle is. So you might actually be going in the right direction and gaining weight, but that's because you're losing fat and gaining muscle, which is the right direction to go. Many people find it very useful to use some kind of physical activity monitor. It might be a Fitbit, it might be a Suunto, a Garmin or whatever, so you can manage that. There are many apps on mobile telephones as well. You can get devices now that measure the acetone in your breath, one of the key ketone bodies, to check whether you're in ketosis. The Ketonix meter that I use is one such device. For those who are not burning fat as easily as they thought might be the case, there may be particular genetic polymorphisms that are getting in the way of this. So going to a practitioner to undertake some tests of your single nucleotide polymorphisms, your SNPs, your SNPs, can be very useful to identify where those are and what they are. This is the kind of output you get from the Ketonix meter that actually shows when you're actually moving into ketosis or nutritional ketosis. So to summarize, I just want to focus on 6 of the key steps that can be taken to get yourself into metabolic balance so that you can anti-age from the inside out. The first is to get yourself fully prepared. That means getting rid of processed carbs and sugars out of your heart. Acknowledge where food intolerance is coming, and it's really helpful to get other members of your family and friends on board so you're not doing it on your own. You've got to often start to reprogram your meal timing. That means maintaining more than 5 hours between each bout of eating, your meal times, having more than 12-hour periods during your overnight fast, 6 days a week, and not consuming food within 2 hours of bed so that you can put out that fire of inflammation. And you should also be thinking, if you're going to be taking any endurance exercise, exactly when you're depleting your glycogen reserves and then replenishing them. So it may mean on the day or so, particularly the evening before a day in which you take a lot of activity, you might want to actually up the amount of complex carbohydrates you might consume. For example, more sweet potato or more gluten-free carbohydrate such as brown rice at that time. You want to be looking at your food composition. Food composition is key, and we've got lots of details on how you might do that through the Food for Health plate. If you're taking a lot of exercise, you also want to be consuming electrolytes, and don't forget concentrated sources of nutrients that are often missing from the diet. Whether you take those in supplemental form or you take them in the diet is of course your choice, and there's a lot that can be done by thinking more carefully about the choice of herbs and spices that we use, using particularly fresh ones rather than the dehydrated ones that we find in jars as culinary herbs and spices that have often lost a lot of their key phytochemicals. We also need to plan our physical activity. So you need to choose how you're going to be active, when you're going to be active, what kind of activities they are, and that does include doing things about the house or the garden. You want to alternate your resistance and strength training with your endurance and cardiovascular training. You probably want to train 2 to 3 times a week in a fasted state, and maybe include 2 or 3 sessions of high intensity interval training every week as well. And last but not least, you need to plan your rest, your relaxation, and your sleep. For most people, that means getting 6 to 9 hours sleep. Of course, that will depend on the individual, depend on the amount of stress you have. You need to be engaging with approaches that allow you to find peace of mind. There's very clear evidence that meditation, for example, can be very, very useful for this. But for others, it might be walking in the forest, or for me, it's often cycling a bike in a forest. You need to also look at what it is that you find purpose and meaning in your life, so that you can live in the moment. For me, it's quite easy. I live in ANH. I have purpose in everything I do through my work. But it's also important to find times to integrate into the community, to socialize, and to give back more than you take. When you get all of that right, you know it's right when you are really genuinely happy and finding time to laugh. So on that note, I'm going to just draw you back to our key websites, aninternational.org and bitethesun.org, where you'll find plenty more information. So live a healthy, long life, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thank you.